king is gone by morning. Not dead, vanished from power. A constitutional process that should take months collapses in hours. By the time Parliament convenes, the throne already has a new occupant. But the speed isn't what haunts the official records. It's the silence that came before it. 3 intelligence agencies had been circling the same woman for 18 months. They never coordinated, never shared findings. Each knew fragments of something larger, but protocol kept them separated. Until December 11th, 1936, when a telegram forced them to compare notes. What they discovered wasn't a scandal. It was a gap, a void where documentation should exist, dates that led nowhere, records that contradicted themselves. And at the center of it all, a twice-divorced American woman whose background unraveled the moment anyone looked closely. The king wanted to marry her. The establishment wanted to stop him. But the real question, buried in files that remain sealed today, was never about marriage. It was about what she'd been doing in Shanghai in 1925. Britain in 1936 operates on certainty. Monarchs follow rules written in blood and precedent. The church defines morality. Society knows its boundaries. Edward VIII becomes king on January 20th. His father, George V, dies at Sandringham after a reign that stabilized the monarchy through World War and Depression. The transition is smooth. Edward is popular, photogenic, modern. He charms crowds. He understands publicity in ways previous monarchs didn't. But his private life contains a complication the public doesn't know about yet. Her name is Wallis Simpson. American, 40 years old, married to her second husband, a London-based businessman. She moves through high society with precision, saying the right things, wearing the right clothes, never overstepping. Edward meets her at a dinner party in 1934. Within weeks, his entire schedule reorganizes around her availability. By 1936, palace staff notice he takes phone calls at 3 a.m., cancels state functions, rewrites his daily agenda to manufacture proximity. The relationship seems like standard royal scandal. Bored heir, foreign temptress, inevitable heartbreak. Nobody realizes they're watching something else entirely. Wallis Simpson's official biography is unremarkable by design. Born 1896, Pennsylvania, modest family, first marriage to Earl Spencer Jr., a naval officer, divorce explained as incompatibility, second marriage to Ernest Simpson, civilized and modern. She'd lived in China from 1924 to 1925 while married to Spencer, who was stationed there with the Navy. Then a gap. Then America. Then London, 1928. The Home Office processes her entry visa without incident. Nothing flags. She's a businessman's wife relocating for work. The system has procedures for this. She fits them perfectly. But immigration files are only as reliable as the documents used to create them. And in 1928, transatlantic passenger manifests are still handwritten, cross-referenced against entry cards that frequently go missing. Wallis's passport shows extensive travel. Shanghai, Hong Kong, Peking, then 14 months where her location becomes vague. She describes it later as time recovering from illness at a relative's home in Virginia. No medical records are requested. Nobody asks why a woman recovering from illness would need 14 months in an era when transatlantic voyage takes less than 2 weeks. The omission isn't suspicious in 1928. It becomes suspicious later, when people start asking questions the files can't answer. Edward becomes obsessed. Not infatuated, obsessed. He cancels appointments with Dominion leaders to have dinner with her, ignores advisors who suggest discretion. His private secretary begins documenting the king's behavior in memos that use careful, clinical language to describe something approaching compulsion. Wallis doesn't push, doesn't demand. She exists in perfect equilibrium, present but not dependent, interested but not possessive. Edward interprets this as authenticity. His advisors see control. One courtier writes to another in October 1934. She has studied him more carefully than he's studied anything in his life. It's not a compliment. By spring 1936, Edward is making plans. He believes he can marry Wallis and remain king. The law is ambiguous. Constitutional scholars disagree about whether divorce disqualifies her. The church objects, but the church has objected before and compromised. He thinks this is negotiable. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin knows it isn't. Baldwin begins drafting abdication protocols in June, 5 months before Edward knows they'll be necessary. The Prime Minister doesn't tell the king because the king isn't being consulted. He's being processed. The first flag appears in April. A junior clerk in the Lord Chamberlain's office is cross-referencing coronation guest lists when he notices a code next to Wallis Simpson's name, BLV 7. He asks his supervisor. The supervisor asks his director. The director finds the code in a filing system from 1917. BLV, Background Limited Verification. Category 7. Second highest level of security concern before someone is formally flagged as a risk. The notation was added in January by someone in the Foreign Office. No explanation, no follow-up. The director calls the Foreign Office. They confirm the flag but decline to elaborate, citing interdepartmental protocol. The Lord Chamberlain's office removes Wallis's name from the coronation list. 2 days later, someone with classified access overrides the decision. Her name is restored. The notation disappears. The junior clerk never finds out who intervened. But the flag doesn't disappear from other systems. It just stops being visible. July 19, 1936. An intelligence report arrives at MI5 from a field agent in Hong Kong. The report concerns pre-war Japanese espionage networks in China. Wallis Simpson appears in a footnote. The footnote describes an American woman matching her description, seen multiple times at a private residence in Shanghai, 1925. The residence is owned by an Italian naval intelligence intermediary. She's accompanied by a British officer, whose name appears in separate files, related to compromised communications about Singapore's harbor defenses. The MI5 analyst flags it, sends requests to the Admiralty, Foreign Office, and Scotland Yard for any records on Wallis Warfield between 1924 and 1926. The Admiralty responds, no records. The Foreign Office responds, no records. Scotland Yard never responds. The analyst documents this, escalates to his supervisor. The file is classified and transferred to a restricted archive. It won't be touched again until 1999. By then, everyone involved will be dead. Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson is finalized October 27, 1936. The proceedings take 90 minutes. English divorce law typically requires extended separation. Months of documentation, verified grounds. This divorce moves with unusual speed. The judge has discretion to waive procedural delays. He exercises that discretion without documented justification. Ernest Simpson doesn't contest. No financial disputes, no complications. He later tells friends he was visited by government men who suggested the divorce would be in everyone's best interest. He never elaborates. When reporters follow up decades later, he declines all interviews. Legal experts reviewing the case in the 1980s note the timeline doesn't align with standard practice. Something or someone accelerated the process. The palace denies involvement. But someone ensured obstacles vanished. Someone with access to judicial scheduling and the ability to make procedural requirements dissolve. The divorce is legal, but the efficiency suggests coordination beyond what two private citizens could arrange. November, Edward drafts a radio address. He plans to speak directly to the British people, explaining his position without Parliament or church mediation. He believes if people understand his feelings, they'll support him. His private secretary warns this would be seen as constitutional overreach. Edward agrees to wait. He spends the delay revising the speech, making it more emotional, more personal. Stanley Baldwin obtains a copy through channels that are never disclosed. He reads it aloud to the cabinet on November 24th. The cabinet votes unanimously. If Edward attempts to broadcast, they resign en masse. The government collapses. Edward is forced to abdicate immediately. Baldwin doesn't tell Edward about the vote. He simply suggests, in their next meeting, that the speech be tabled for now. Edward interprets this as cautious support. Baldwin means it as a final warning. By late November, every institution has been polled: Parliament, Cabinet, Church, Dominion governments. The answer is universal. Marriage to Wallis Simpson is unacceptable. Edward can abdicate or remain king alone. No third option will be permitted. He still doesn't believe them. The telegram arrives at 4:47 a.m., December 11th. It's from an American private investigator, Wallis, hired in September to prepare documentation for anticipated public scrutiny. What he found were gaps. Records that should exist but don't. Dates that conflict across official documents. A 6-month period in 1925 where passenger manifests show her leaving Shanghai, but no corresponding entry into any other port. The investigator contacted the State Department, Navy personnel records, diplomatic archives. One archivist mentioned certain records from that period had been administratively sealed in 1927 due to ongoing investigations of foreign intelligence activities. The investigator sent Wallis a preliminary report. She panicked. Not because the report contained evidence. It didn't, just questions. But she understood how questions would be weaponized. She instructed him to send a full summary to the palace. Hopping controlled disclosure would be less damaging than eventual discovery. She didn't realize the palace already knew. The king's private secretary reads the telegram twice. Locks his office door. Makes 3 phone calls. MI5, Foreign Office, Stanley Baldwin's private residence. Each call begins the same way. We need to review the Simpson file immediately. The MI5 officer confirms multiple flags between 1925 and 1928. Locations and social circles associated with intelligence gathering. Nothing rose to formal investigation because activities were ambiguous, contacts explainable through social circumstances. The Foreign Office confirms monitoring since 1934 at the request of Dominion governments. Assessment: manipulative and calculating, but not actively working for a foreign power. Baldwin asks one question: does the king know any of this? The answer is no. Edward has been protected from intelligence assessments by advisors who believed ignorance would prevent him from making a bad situation worse. Baldwin makes a decision. Edward will never be told. The crisis will be resolved on constitutional grounds. The intelligence concerns will remain classified. December 11th, 10:00 a.m. Edward is summoned to meet Baldwin, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his private secretary. He expects negotiation. Instead, Baldwin places a single document on the table. An abdication instrument, already drafted, requiring only signature. Edward asks what changed. Baldwin says nothing changed. This is formalization of what Edward has been told repeatedly. Edward refuses, says he needs time. Public opinion is shifting. Baldwin says the coronation is scheduled for May 12, 1937. If Edward is unmarried at that date, he'll be crowned. If he marries before, he abdicates. Those are the only scenarios. Edward asks what happens if he refuses both. Baldwin says Parliament will pass legislation restricting the king's marriage rights. Constitutional crisis, mechanisms never tested, permanent damage to the monarchy. Edward realizes, in that moment, he's already lost. He signs on December 10th. The date is backdated for cleaner historical records. Edward VII ceases to be king. His brother Albert becomes George VI. The transition happens so quickly most of the public learns about the crisis and resolution simultaneously. Edward's radio address aired December 11th. Eloquent, emotional, incomplete. He explained he couldn't continue without the woman he loved, thanked his brother, asked for understanding. He didn't mention intelligence flags, the investigation into Wallis's background, the administrative pressure that made her divorce unusually efficient. The public heard a love story that ended a reign. What they didn't hear was that the love story had been shadowed by intelligence concerns, diplomatic maneuvering, and institutional forces that decided long before Edward did that his marriage would not be permitted. Wallis listened from France. She'd left England a week earlier, advised by lawyers that remaining would expose her to scrutiny she wanted to avoid. Witnesses disagreed about whether her tears were genuine. They married June 3, 1937. Small ceremony. No royal family attended. Edward became Duke of Windsor. Wallis became Duchess, but was denied Her Royal Highness, a decision that embittered Edward for life. They lived as exiles. France, briefly the Bahamas during the war, then France permanently. Too famous to disappear, too controversial to rehabilitate. Edward died 1972. Wallis lived until 1986, increasingly reclusive, reportedly suffering dementia in final years. Her estate was auctioned. Her papers sealed by legal agreement, some scheduled for release in 2037. The full MI5 file declassified in 1999 confirmed surveillance, confirmed concerns, but concluded she'd never been a foreign agent. Just a woman in wrong places with wrong connections. Pursued by a man who had the wrong job for personal happiness. But the declassified file contained a note, added 1954, by an analyst reviewing closed cases. Additional materials held under separate classification, not included in this file. Those materials have never been released. Freedom of information, requests denied on grounds of national security. Which makes no sense for a woman dead nearly 40 years whose activities, if they existed, occurred a century ago. Either the materials reveal something genuinely sensitive about wartime intelligence operations, or they reveal the official story was simpler than the truth. Historians have theories. Some believe Wallis was unwittingly involved in intelligence networks during her time in China. Others think she was actively recruited and managed by British intelligence to get close to Edward, either for monitoring or influence. A few suggest the entire abdication was orchestrated to remove a king seen as dangerously sympathetic to Nazi Germany, with Wallis as convenient excuse. The evidence is circumstantial. Gaps in records, unusual efficiency of her divorce, speed with which Baldwin moved once he had justification. The fact so many files remain sealed. Edward's personal papers include a letter he wrote to Wallis in 1938, but apparently never sent, found sealed in an envelope marked private. The letter describes a conversation with a Foreign Office official shortly before abdication. The official told him certain matters of state security made his marriage to Wallis impossible, but declined to specify what those matters were. Edward wrote, "Did they know before I did that I'd have to choose? Did they know what you were before I met you, or did they only investigate after?" Wallis never answered because she never received it. Or perhaps she did answer, and that correspondence is among the sealed materials. What's documented? Edward VII abdicated after less than 11 months as king. Married a woman whose background contained enough irregularities that multiple intelligence agencies flagged her. Official reason: constitutional and religious objection to divorce. Unofficial reason: classified materials that remain sealed. The British monarchy survived. George VI proved exactly the king the nation needed during World War II. Elizabeth II became one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. The abdication crisis became a footnote, a romantic tragedy, a cautionary tale about love versus duty. But every historian who researches the period deeply comes away with the same feeling. There's a story beneath the story. Something that explains why so much documentation is missing or classified. Something that explains why Baldwin moved so decisively once he had leverage. Something that explains the note in the MI5 file referencing materials held elsewhere. Royal historians can request access to those materials. The requests are processed, reviewed by committees, and denied with polite regret. Perhaps in 2037, when remaining seals expire. Perhaps not even then. There's a photograph from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's wedding. Edward is smiling, genuinely happy, perhaps the happiest he'd ever been photographed. Wallis is looking slightly to the side, toward someone or something outside the frame. Her expression is harder to read. One biographer described it as the look of someone who'd won something, but wasn't certain what the prize included. Another called it the face of a woman who realized too late she'd become evidence of whatever story needed to be told. Both are speculation. Wallis never explained the expression. She rarely spoke about the abdication in later years. When she did, she told a simple story. Two people in love who paid a price for that love. Nothing more complex. Nothing more ambiguous. Edward told the same story. Whether they believed it, or whether they'd agreed it was the safest version is impossible to know. What's certain is the abdication involved more actors than just the two of them. More motivations than love and constitutional law. More documentation than the public has ever been allowed to see. The abdication crisis is a masterclass in how political institutions manage threats without public disclosure. No dramatic arrests, no public accusations. Just quiet pressure, procedural efficiency, narrative control. A constitutional crisis resolved in weeks. A king removed without revolution. A potentially dangerous relationship ended without scandal becoming security breach. The machinery of power operated exactly as designed. The question is whether the machinery was responding to a genuine threat or manufacturing one to justify a predetermined outcome. We won't know until the files are released. If they're ever released. Until then, we have the official story. Edward VIII abdicated for love. And we have the gaps in that story, the missing records, the sealed files, the unanswered questions. The gaps suggest the official story wasn't false. Just incomplete. Somewhere in those sealed files is the sentence that completes it. The sentence that explains why a king born to rule walked away after 11 months. The sentence that explains who Wallis Simpson actually was, what she represented, what threat she posed or didn't pose. That sentence hasn't been written in any history book yet. Perhaps it never will be. The telegram that arrived December 11th, 1936, is preserved in the Royal Archives. Portions redacted. What remains visible? Subject's background contains inconsistencies requiring clarification before public roll. The clarifications never happened publicly. They may have happened privately, in rooms where minutes weren't kept and participants signed agreements that expire long after they're dead. Edward and Wallis lived as exiles, not prisoners, but not quite free. They traveled, entertained, maintained the appearance of lives well lived. But Edward never stopped believing he'd been denied something rightfully his. And Wallis never stopped being the woman who caused a king to fall. Whether she caused it through ambition, accident, or assignment remains the question the sealed files might answer. If they answer it at all. The investigation concluded Wallis Simpson wasn't a spy. But the files remain classified. Which means either the investigation was wrong, or what she actually was is somehow worse than what she wasn't. The British monarchy learned from the crisis. Never again would a monarch reach Edward's position without romantic relationships being vetted, managed, controlled. The institution protected itself by ensuring no one person could ever threaten it so completely. Which means Edward's abdication wasn't just his story. It was a lesson, codified in classified protocols, teaching future generations how to prevent love from becoming a constitutional weapon. The lesson required a villain. Wallis Simpson became that villain, whether she earned the role or was assigned it. The telegram sits in the archives, redacted and incomplete. Like the story itself. Like every story where power decides what can be known and what must remain, forever, just out of reach.